students. As part of our ongoing interview series, I want to introduce you to Holy Cross employer partner, Rachel Salkin, who works at Beacon Hill Staffing. Rachel is going to discuss the behavioral-based interview. Welcome, Rachel. I'm really excited to talk with you today and have this conversation about behavioral-based interviews, as I know more and more employers are leaning into this interview technique. Can you start by telling us briefly about yourself, your current role, and your career journey since graduating from UNH?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Pam. So excited to be here today. I am a corporate recruiter at Beacon Hill Staffing Group, so I am in charge of, entry-level hiring. I graduated from UNH in 2018. I was a business management major, which is great because it's so broad, but at the same time, I didn't really know which path to take after graduation. So I ended up getting into banking. I stayed in that field for 3 years, gained a lot of great knowledge and experience, but soon, realized I wanted something a little more relationship oriented. So that's kind of what brought me to Beacon Hill. So I have been here the past almost 8 months. And yeah, I'm excited to talk about behavioral-based interviews today.
Awesome, great. Thank you so much. And we're really happy to have you. So
Yeah.
students, first I want to just maybe give a little bit of background or definition of what behavioral-based interviewing is. So basically it's a technique that focuses on a candidate's past experience to assess how they navigate specific situations using skills relevant to the position to which they're now interviewing. The assumption is that past behavior is the best predictor of future behavior. When you are in a behavioral-based interview, some of the questions that you'll be asked will often start with, tell me about a time when, talk with me about something, and can you share an example of? So just to give you a little bit of background, and oftentimes employers use only behavioral-based techniques or interview questions, and then some do a combination of those and more open-ended traditional questions. So Rachel, I'm just going to dive in to my questions for you. So again, from your experience as a recruiter, what is the benefit of using the behavioral-based technique interview and why?
Yeah, absolutely. So industries like sales and staffing are so, relationship oriented. We're constantly, talking to clients and candidates, facing many different situations. There's going to be a lot of highs and lows, of our jobs and, talking to these different customers and clients. So we're really looking to see how students are going to react, upon different situations.
Great, great. Can you talk a little bit about what is the best way for a student or a candidate to respond to a behavioral-based question?
Absolutely. So I always refer to the STAR method. So, instead of just giving, a brief answer, we really like to hear, the situation you were faced, the task that was asked of you, the action that you took and what the end result was. So, for example, if you were asked, maybe explain a time you, dealt with rejection, how did you handle it? So, I give the example of, maybe talking about an internship that you didn't get, maybe instead of just saying, yeah, I really, really wanted this internship. Unfortunately, it didn't work out for me. So I kind of, just bounced back and, continued on with my search. Using the STAR method, you could explain, maybe, me and my friend, we were both, really excited about this potential internship. I went into the interview, I thought I did great. After the fact, I got a call that they selected another student for the internship. At first I was super bummed out about it, but I decided to actually, reach back out to the recruiter and ask for, feedback on, what I did well, what I could improve on. And using that feedback, I was then able to apply it to my next interview and, it went great. And I got, another internship that was a great opportunity for me. So just kind of, how you approach the question, giving us, a lot of context, how you handled it, and really what the end result was, gives us a better idea of, how you really dealt with that situation.
Great, good. Okay, I like that example. So that was one example of a question. Can you give some other, maybe of some of your favorite behavioral-based questions that you typically ask or like to ask in an interview?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would say the biggest ones are, maybe a time you were presented a goal and you didn't see, immediate results. Maybe a time that you dealt with a tough, boss or manager and how you really handled it. How you handle conflict, again, how you handle rejection, tell me about a time. And I really like to, have students prepare, having, maybe like an academic example, maybe an example from, an athletic experience, and then also, a professional experience as well, whether it was an internship or summer job. So definitely, well-rounded examples. So you're not constantly, talking about one specific area.
Sure. And I do the same thing when I help students prep. When a candidate talks about a variety of involvements, if you will, it makes them maybe appear a little bit more three-dimensional.
Absolutely.
So I think most of the questions that you suggested are asking the candidate student to talk about a negative experience. Do you ever ask a behavioral based question that allows them to really talk about a positive experience?
Yeah, great question. I mean, definitely, what's one of, your proudest accomplishments? What was a time that you were, presented a goal and, your action really stood out, or, a time that a manager complimented you, what was that experience?
Okay, good. Because again, when I do mock interviews, I try to ask both.
Great question. And
Good.
absolutely. We do, definitely ask positive experiences as well. Just, sometimes more of those, tough experiences really does kind of show, how you will act in these real life scenarios, but same with positive as well.
Good. Okay, great. So you've already given us some tips. You talked about the STAR method a little bit. What are some other suggestions or tips that you would have for students as they're, we're going into the spring semester, which is a lot of interviews are happening. What other suggestions can you give to our students?
Great question. So what I will say is, definitely do your research beforehand. Know what role you're interviewing for. Know a little bit of background about the company. I always suggest, looking up who you're meeting with on LinkedIn, just so, it always looks good when you can say, oh, I've seen you've been with this company for 10 years. What were you doing beforehand? And tell me about your experience here. And then, I always suggest having personal and professional questions prepared, just so you're not talking about, the role the entire time. Learning more background about these managers is great as well. And, always bring your energy and enthusiasm, and explain why, you're a great fit for this role, and definitely integrate, examples from your resume, back to, being well-rounded, have examples from, athletics, academics, and professional, about why you could really see yourself in this role. And then what I will say, a lot of these interviews are being held virtually still. So, in sense of preparing for those, definitely, make sure, especially if you're in your college dorm, make sure your roommates are out of the room, you have a clear background, it's well lit, make sure you're still dressed professionally, even though you're not necessarily going into an office, how you look is definitely still important. And then, for in-person interviews as well, definitely make sure you're well dressed. And like I said, it all comes back to, energy and enthusiasm. Just really, be your best self day of interview, and, sell yourself, sell those experiences.
Great. Awesome. I love that. And I am going to put in a little plug for Holy Cross students that if you have an interview scheduled, that you can schedule a mock interview with someone on the career development staff, and you can do that make that appointment through Handshake. And in those mock interviews, we will simulate whichever medium that you're going to be having that interview. So if you're going to be having a virtual interview on Zoom, we'll do a mock Zoom interview. If you're going to be doing it in person, we'll do a in-person mock interview. And it's just a great way for you to practice, make your mistakes on us, because we're not going to not give you the job. And then we'll give you some feedback and some advice, suggestions on how to present yourself better in the actual interview. So we highly recommend that.
Yeah, that's a great resource.
Yeah, good. And it's one of my favorite things to do. I love doing mock interviews. Can Can you talk a little bit about what kinds of things that our seniors in particular should be looking for in an entry-level position?
Yeah, absolutely. So a few things. Definitely asking about, the company culture from, different managerial standpoints. I always like to say, try to talk to different members of the team. Maybe somebody who's only been there for like a year, and then a management position, and then someone maybe even above them, and definitely get their different viewpoints on certain topics. Such as the culture. Definitely, ask about the growth of, the growth at a company, what the training process looks like. Is there a mentorship program? And I always say, use this opportunity to really interview the company just as much as they're interviewing you. I know that's kind of the approach we take at Beacon Hill. We want, the students to ask us as many questions as we're asking them, just to kind of see, if it's a mutually good fit.
Awesome. Good, good. Anything I left out?
I don't think so. I mean, I think we've covered a good amount. Like I said in the beginning, I cover all entry level hiring needs for, the New England area. So, if any students are interested, definitely please feel free to, connect us.
Awesome. Good. And so students, just kind of like finalizing, I would say, Rachel really gave some good feedback, advice. Think about all aspects of your resume, all experiences, work experience, internship, classes, extracurriculars. Draw from all of those when thinking about how to answer a behavioral-based interview question. It will really be best if you do that. Rachel, thank you so much for being with us today. I really appreciate
Thank
your
you.
time.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for having me.
Great. It was awesome to see you. Take care.